Hi, I'm Mike Duggan. I've been teaching restorative dentistry for over 32 years now and to over 6,000 dentists. This video shows how I do it. Real-time, mannequin-based, hands-on, point of view, and patient real. If you are a pre-dental student, an aspiring teacher, an international dentist, join me at Duggan Oral Design, dugganoraldesign.com. Anything else that might confuse you at all, or have any kind of question about, or picture a clinical situation. Picture a clinical situation, and anything that we did yesterday that might relate to a clinical situation that you can imagine, and how we would maybe adjust things in order to manage that clinical situation. I got a call this morning from somebody I know that's living in Florida. Her sister lives in New Jersey. It has nothing to do with PFMs, but it has to do with dentistry in general. Her sister had head and neck radiation therapy, had some kind of cancer in the jaw region or whatever. Lost a lot of bone structure, and her general dentist sent her to an endodontist to do endodontics, and the endodontist got halfway through and said, "I'm not going to finish this," and didn't really specify why, and didn't send her to somebody that would. And she's losing teeth and a lot of bone resorption and so forth. So you might get a call from somebody like that, some friend of yours, which I just did, saying, "Help! What do I do? What do I tell my sister? Where do I tell her to go?" That's an interesting problem. The sister is quite distressed and really angry, and her general dentist is really angry at her endodontist and so forth. But of course, there's much more of an issue going on than that. So I told her to contact a dental school and get in touch with the oral surgery department. Probably there's an oral maxillofacial surgeon that's running the oral surgery residency program. And that's why I see your little eye through that little slit in the tripod. Move over to the right a little bit. Or your left, yeah. There. Now she's fine. Now I can see you. Well, welcome back. So anyway, yeah, so I named several schools that are within a reasonable distance of where she's living. I said, yeah, call it, get an appointment in those departments, because you're going to be looked at by a lot of different people. There's going to be a lot of discussion as to what's really the best thing to do, and you're going to trust it 100%, as opposed to trusting some individual person out in the dental community. So yeah, keep that in mind. And when you have some friends that are going through issues, make sure you refer them to my website, okay, so they can answer some questions on their own. Always very helpful. And don't forget, that website's for you guys too. Okay. Speaking of which, I didn't check last night, but I don't know that anybody, maybe one person, signed up for the Udemy course. You're the only one, right? You did? Okay, that's right. Yeah, you did. So, strangely enough, I can actually track you guys. I can actually see who signed up and how much of the course you finished. So I'll be looking at it tonight to find out if you've been through that. I mean, the only one I have up is the Class 2 evaluation, but you're going to need to know as much as possible about evaluating Class 2s for tomorrow, when you're going to be taking an exam. And one of the things you're going to be doing is a Class 2. You're going to be two of them, Class 2 composite and Class 2 amalgam. So it'd be nice if you had a more refined sense of how to evaluate it. So that's what that particular Udemy course is about. So yeah, there might be a correlation between who signs on and actually works through the course and how they do tomorrow. Could be a correlation. You never know. I know there's a pretty strong correlation between how well you're doing in the visualization exercises, the little cube things. How well you do on those, and how well you learn to do on those, how much work you put in to learn how to see those clearly, and how you're going to do tomorrow. So, visualization, hugely valuable. Anything you can do to improve it, is, of course, hugely valuable as well. Okay, well, any questions about anything? You know, we're going to talk about full ceramics and class 3s in a few minutes. Before the end of the day, we're going to be practicing on some preps that you're a little bit concerned about getting more practice on. But any questions about anything that we've done so far, and you know what the purpose of it is, what the foundational concepts are behind it, what the basic techniques are, how to see what you need to see. Everything pretty clear, or you haven't really put all your confusion issues together yet? Maybe you're confused about 5 things. Yeah, I'd like to know what they are. Anybody can put their finger on one right now that's of concern? Or you think you've got it pretty well understood, but not quite?
Reduction, A plane, B plane, and the C plane, when we do the occlusion reduction. So...
Upper or lower?
Upper.
Okay.
And lower for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, actually lower, because my A plane, like sometimes I end up, like there's no distinction between the A plane and the B plane, and there are times when there's just the A plane and the C plane, and the B plane is like invisible, so.
Oh, the poor thing.
So that's something that I need to work on, and I don't understand how do I like.
Yeah, okay, so one of the most important things when you're doing the occlusal reduction, of course, is the vertical angulation that you're using in each of those planes. We're trying to reduce a series of contacts, and those contacts are on inclines that are sloping this way, so we do a plane of reduction that slopes that way. And then for the B plane, we do contacts that are on planes that are sloping this way, so we do our reduction sloping this way, and then this way in the C plane. Now we know what to look for in terms of clearance and reduction. Pay attention especially to the vertical angle, and then secondarily pay attention to the direction of the ridges, where they are and how they're directed, which direction they're going. Of course, that's determined by the direction you point the burr. And then pay attention to, you know, can you make a nice flat plane? Can you make it come down to the marginal ridge, and can you make it go down here and then bring the end of the burr out the facial or lingual groove? So you get a flat plane out that groove and a flat plane down that groove, so you get a nicely defined groove. Nicely defined ridge as you're coming down to the marginal ridges. Reduce the marginal ridges enough so you've got some reduction there, because then you can start to do the rest of the anatomy a little bit more reasonably. But you know, the biggest error I see is typically vertical angle. But again, make sure your typodon's well equilibrated. If you have your typodont with good occlusion to begin with, then, you know, when you're doing the A-plane reduction, do it at the right angle. But again, we start by positioning the grooves. So when I was looking at your preps the last couple of days and looking at ground preps, and especially the lower one with the A-plane, I'm using the mirror and I'm looking up the A-plane, and I'm looking to see where the grooves are in your A-plane compared to the opposing cusps. And here's the opposing cusp, and you got a groove way over here. So what are you thinking? All right? So you know I did that picture up here, and you can see exactly what it should look like when you have the A-plane like this, and then every time it comes down, it's right where there's a cusp. The cusp are telling you, put the groove there. This cusp is telling you, put the groove here, okay? And you're putting it in the wrong place, and then if somebody looks at it, like I look at it, and I look up that A-plane, I see the grooves are totally mismatched, okay? So what is that supposed to tell me? Somebody's not paying attention. Okay? Somebody's not looking at what the situation is and deciding what's the best thing to do in this particular situation. We're always matching the prep to the opposing team. Okay? Every part of it. A-plane, then the B-plane, then the C-plane, so forth. And the vertical angle is a critical part of it. But that A-plane, it's just so obvious it's so easy to see the clearances on the A-plane, because they're just right in front of you. You just look up in the mirror and there they are. And when it's not matching the opposing tooth, it looks like you just don't know quite what you're doing. Okay? So focus in on that. That's for sure. And same thing with the maxillary arch. Make sure that you put those ridges for your facial cusp, mesiofacial, distal facial. Make sure you position them right where the opposing grooves are of the untouched mandibular tooth. Position them carefully so you get clearance on both sides of that ridge, both sides of this ridge. So again, those are, kind of basic things that you just need to be paying attention to. We're not just in there just grinding away in the tooth randomly. We're really trying to fit it to the opposing tooth. The lab will be fitting the crown to the opposing tooth, so you need to make sure you give something to the lab that allows him to do or her to do their jobs. Okay? So yeah, maybe slow down a little bit. Okay? Don't rush through it. Start with the A plane, then you groove here. Is that where the cusp is? Okay, good. Make a groove over here. Is that where the cusp is? That's good. Just leave those grooves there, and then make it nice and smooth in between. Okay?
So like when we do axial reduction and lower, we are talking about like facial involved or proximal. But when we do facial reduction, we always lose like our, A plane. And then we have to always like go back and make that again. Like why is that happening? Is that we
So
are
why is it happening?
not getting it, or we are like doing too much facial reduction?
Why is it happening? Did you figure it out?
And maybe we are doing like too much facial reduction. Or
By
maybe
too much,
the
you mean getting a
angulation.
ski jump? You're getting a heavy chamfer on the facial?
More heavy shampoo.
So you're getting too much facial reduction. Does that mean you're getting a heavy chamfer or a ski jump? Or is it some other way? There are two ways of over-reducing the facial. One is by cutting in too far, and the other is by over-tapering. Right?
Okay.
So if you cut in too far, at the gingival part of that wall, it's over-reduced. The chamfer is too heavy, you probably get a ski jump. If you over-taper, you might not even have much of a chamfer at all. But at the top, at the occlusal part of the wall, it's over-reduced because you just lean the burr in like this. So if you're doing the facial reduction like this, of course, you're going to over-taper and lose your A plane. Okay? Now, the other possibility is that your typonut isn't equilibrated. You didn't have to reduce the A plane very much. You didn't have to do much reduction in that plane in order to get clearance. So if you didn't reduce it very much, by the time you over-taper at all on that facial side, the A plane's gone because, there just wasn't much of it there because you didn't have to reduce very much because you didn't have occlusion in the first place. So again, when we equilibrate the typonut to make sure you get good occlusal contacts, then we learn how to make the planes as reduced as they need to be so they get the clearance. And then we're not as likely to lose them, even if we accidentally over-taper too much on the facial, for example. So again, you have to look at your situation and evaluate it and determine in your particular case, where did it go? What's happening? Why did I lose that A plane? I can only give you some suggestions. Here are all the different possibilities of why people lose their A planes. And then you have to look at it and see if that's the case for you. That's why I said yesterday for the lower premolar PFM prep, make sure it's in good occlusion to start with. That was why you chose that particular lower premolar, is because you knew it would be, or either is or would be in good occlusion. So we knew the A plane on that. And then we do the facial reduction. You're going to do, it's a PFM, you're going to do a full millimeter of facial reduction at the shoulder. And even if you get the taper just perfect, and then make the secondary plane, if your A plane was smaller than it should have been because you didn't have a good occlusion to begin with, then your A plane is going to disappear. Your facial cusp is going to look completely sharp. It's going to look like a non-functional cusp. But again, if your typonut's not well equilibrated, and again, you chose yesterday to do the lower premolar prep on a tooth that was good occlusion, so I expect the A plane to be there, unless, of course, you vastly over-tapered the facial. And again, when we look along the wall and compare the facial taper to the middle third of the adjacent teeth, then you're not over-tapering. And your full millimeter at the shoulder, don't get a millimeter and a half, then you should be fine to make a little secondary plane and still have some A plane left. But that one's particularly delicate. If you have an A plane that's smaller than it needs to be, and if you over-taper the facial, you're going to lose it pretty quickly on that one. So the lower molars, as long as they're in good occlusion, they're much easier to deal with and much less likely to lose your A plane. You don't have to be quite as conscientious. Certainly, and I'm glad you're noticing that it's disappearing, then the next thing to do is figure out, why did that happen in this particular case?
Okay, but
For the upper molars, when you're preparing for a full crown, do you need a secondary plane on the facial side?
I don't know. So I said, I don't know. I'm uncertain.
If you,
So can you tell me why I'm uncertain?
Because of the taper, how tapered the prep is.
Yeah, I don't know how you did the prep before that. You know, when you're deciding how to make a second, that whether you need a secondary plane or not, it depends on how much you've already tapered it, right? So again, the burr decides if we need the secondary plane. So take the burr, put it against the adjacent tooth at the level of the occlusal third, bring it back to your prep. If there's anything to cut at that angle, then go ahead and cut it. It means you didn't over taper that much. But if you over tapered and you put the burr against the adjacent tooth at the level of the occlusal third, come back over here, if you've already got that angle, then clearly there's nothing to cut. So that's how we decide whether to do the secondary plane or not. Just compare it to the adjacent tooth. And then if there's something to cut at that angle, then we cut it. Okay, so the
Function
upper,
of the secondary plane is it to just give more thickness for the material of this part?
exactly.
But do you really need more thickness for the material, for the fascia part, and the occlusal part in that prep?
You might. I don't know how much material you have right now, but if you compare the angulation of the adjacent tooth at the level of the occlusal third to your wall that you've done already, if there's nothing to cut, you don't need more material. If there is something to cut at that angle, you do need more material. Okay, so again, you're visualizing that the lab's going to make the crown match the contour of the adjacent tooth. That's their job. And you just have to make sure that your prep allows them to do that without the gold getting too thin. So we're always comparing it to the contour of the adjacent tooth. One thing you can do is you can take a number 2 Explorer and put it against the adjacent tooth and rotate it so the curvature of the Explorer matches the contour of the adjacent tooth, and then bring it over like this to your prep. You might see, okay, here's the curvature of the Explorer, and your wall comes up like this, and it's too thin right here, but the secondary plane would have fixed that. Okay. So again, it's understanding, why it is that we're doing it, and then that's going to give you a good start when it comes to figuring out if you need to do it. Okay?
So it's not like you give a secondary plane depending upon the taper of the preparation, right? So even like in gold crowns, when we are doing so, we don't need the secondary plane for that as well, right? Like only if the taper is like, it's too much, like.
Okay. So if you have too much taper, you would not need a secondary plane typically.
Okay.
If your taper is exactly what it should be. Now that we're doing the PFMs, we've discussed what's the best taper. When we did the full crowns, and the 3/4 crowns, we just decided, okay, so if this is the axis of the tooth, lean the burr a couple degrees toward the axis, we're good. Okay, but now we're being much more specific for the PFMs. We're saying, okay, make a mark in the middle third, touch the burr to the mark, and that's the taper that you should have for the PFMs. The PFMs are, of course, most sensitive to the exact amount of taper. So you can use that same technique to get the taper for the full crowns for the posterior teeth as well. Again, just take the taper from the middle third of the adjacent tooth, and if you've got that tapered, you'll need a secondary plane in every surface except the lower lingual. Okay, so again, if you're building a crown that matches the lingual surface of the lower teeth and the adjacent teeth, well, the crown's going to tip out this way. Okay, because that's how all the lingual surfaces of the lower teeth go. So it's going to lean out lingually. So if you get any taper at all, you got tons of gold. And again, if you take the burr and put it against the occlusal surface of the lingual surface of the adjacent tooth at the level of the occlusal third, then you bring it over to the prep that you did, there won't be anything to cut at that angle because you've already cut that angle, if you have any taper at all. So again, it's just a matter of looking at the precise situation you have and deciding what to do. The main thing is visualizing how thick the gold's going to be. I've given you a basic technique for figuring out if you need a secondary plane or not, but in reality, it's to make sure there's enough thickness of gold. So just look at it and figure out if there is. Okay, if there isn't, then do something about it. Okay, so again, I don't want you to have a sort of memorized set of steps. we do preps in steps, but, the most important thing is to determine that each step is done well and it's accomplished its job, and it sets you up for doing the next step well, and to know what each step is supposed to accomplish, basically. So if you understand that, then you'll always do great, okay? And if you understand that, 25 years from now, you'll still be doing great preps, okay? Because understanding why it is that we do each step the way that we do that's a lifelong learning experience, okay? If you don't get it, but just have a sequence of steps that you remember from school that you're supposed to do, 25 years from now, you won't remember what those steps are. You could have practiced for 25 years and not remember what those steps are, and not remember how to determine if your prep actually does work. And I don't think I mentioned it in this class, but most notably, I had a student many years ago. I was working with a lot of dentists that were practicing in California that wanted to move to a different state. So they needed to take a licensure exam in another state. So I did a course for them, and one of my favorite students in that course, he had been practicing for 25 years, and he wasn't happy. And he wasn't happy because he didn't know whether he was doing good dentistry or not. He didn't know that's why he wasn't happy, but he just wasn't happy. And he thought, okay, if I start to practice again in another state, if I start over, I'll be happy. Well, he took the course and he learned, okay, well, that's why we do it this way. That's how it works. That's how to solve the problem on the patient's tooth. Now I get it. And he never really got it in school, and then it got worse and worse and more uncertain as he went along. So once he started getting it, he was going back to his practice every week. During the course, we just met on weekends, so he'd practice all week, and he was getting happier and happier as he went through the course. And every week he's saying, man, I did some good work this week. That was really cool. So we figured out pretty quickly that the reason he wasn't happy in his practice is because he didn't know if he was doing a good job for his patients. And of course, I love the guy because he cared. He didn't know why he was unhappy, but he cared enough that once he figured it out, he really started doing a good job. And then he never did take the exam. He never did move his practice to another state, and he started teaching in dental school. Once he got it, once it made sense to him, he wanted to share. So that was pretty cool. So that leaves, opens up a lot of options for you guys too. Once it really makes sense, once you really get it, then the world is yours. Okay? You do the best job for your patients, you'll enjoy your practice more, and it'd be cool if you went back and shared with other people at some point. That's always a good idea. Okay, thank you. Anything else that's of concern right now?
Sounds funny, but still I want to ask. So if we lose 8 plane by doing too much reduction on facial,
Okay.
So can we go back and make it 8 plane?
Okay, so you got a B plane like this, you've over tapered the facial reduction, and so your A plane's kind of gone.
Yeah.
But that tip is, 1.5 millimeters from the opposing tooth. So if you make a significant A plane there, you'll have more clearance than you want. You got to get rid of the tip. You've got to get rid of that sharp edge. So, at least put a small bevel on there. Small bevel is, going to look like it's trying to grow up and be an A plane. But you don't have too much clearance, But yeah, once you've, I see a lot of times people that I think do that. They get the B plane and they get the over tapering and they lose their A plane, then they put the A plane back on. And when they put it back on, they're not paying attention to the opposing tooth, and then by the time they finish it, they look, and it's 2.5 millimeters clearance. Okay, so that's not really going to work out very well. But of course, when you're learning how to do this, when you have that happen, then next time you do a prep on the same tooth, you do something different. Okay? Make sure it's an occlusion to begin with. Make sure you don't over taper. Get the good clearance you want on the A plane. Make sure you have the right vertical angle. Check all those clearances in each of those areas. Then you don't have to deal with all that stuff, okay? Because it always comes out. So anyway, Pay attention to what you did that got you in trouble and, fix it as best you can. But then the most important thing to do is make sure that the next time you do it, you've learned from your mistakes and you do something different. Okay? Okay, yes?
Doctor, this might be a basic question, but for my mandibular posterior crown preps, I always end up extending my B plane into the C plane.
Okay.
So the central groove is shifted a bit too far lingually.
Okay.
And it's been happening
Why
always.
have I told you that's happening? I think I've told you that that's happening. I think I've told you why.
Yeah, you said that I was not not positioning the tip of my burr correctly.
Well,
Why
that's kind of
using
given.
the
If
blades
the end of the burr is creating the central groove and the central groove is too far lingually, then the tip of the burr is too far lingually. But why is it? Why did the tip of the burr get too far lingually? It happens a lot. Several people have had it happen.
Yeah, direction, angulation is not correct, like the vertical angle is.
The
like-
vertical angle. Yeah. The direction of the burr gives ridges and so forth, but it's the vertical angle. If I have it like this, the central groove is right here, right? If I make it too horizontal, then all of a sudden the central groove moves lingually. So we're going to take the vertical angle from the B plane from the adjacent tooth, and if we do that, and then, when you're doing it, keep an eye on how it's working. Check your vertical angle and check when you're making these planes, make sure you have the central groove where you want it. Okay? So pay attention to it while you're doing it, but make sure you get, if you at least choose your vertical angle wisely matching the adjacent teeth, then when you're doing it, your central groove is going to tend to end up in just the right place.
Can we just mark the central groove just in case, because even I tend to go a little bit lingually, like my central groove is a little bit lingual. Can I just mark the central groove so that I know where I'm placing the burr? Like,
Absolutely. Yeah. So if it's not obvious from looking at the tooth, take a pencil and run it through the central groove of the tooth. Now, what you might want to do is after you've done, it doesn't make any sense this way. So when you're doing the B plane, neither the B plane nor the C plane are reduced. The central groove is still intact. It's still the original central groove. Put a pencil mark in the middle of it. Maybe it'll be a little more visible for you to see. Whatever you can do. And then, once you've done it once and you've controlled the vertical angle and you see, okay, now it's easy to keep it right on top of that groove, then you're not going to have to do that again. Okay? You'll know to check the vertical angle. So that's a really critical thing. The vertical angles on these preps, we have opposing teeth have a lot of anatomy. Now, we don't always have that, as we've discussed in patients, but to the extent that patients have a certain amount of anatomy, whatever the angulation of those planes are, you want to try to mimic that with our prep so that, again, the crown can fit the opposing teeth as well as possible. But once you start changing the vertical angle and make it too horizontal, central groove gets shifted way over toward the lingual, you cut off your A plane with the B plane, okay? And then it's really easy to, if you over taper the facial at all, or even put a secondary plane that's, a little heavy, then your A plane's completely gone. So, again, look and pay attention to what's getting you in trouble and try to analyze it. Okay? So what I do is I go around and I analyze the situation for everybody and, really take that in. If I tell you that the plane is too horizontal, and that's why your central groove got shifted lingually, I've told that to a bunch of people here already, then, make sure that makes sense to you. Again, if it makes sense to you, just geometrically, then you're going to do it differently next time. So again, as I told you on the first day of the course, whatever makes sense in this course is something that you will have forever. You can take it home with you. It will not leak out of your ears on the plane. If something doesn't make sense, then by the time you get home, it's gone. If it makes sense, then you got it forever. Okay, so again, and a lot of times we don't make sense of something, we don't make true sense of something, unless we've kind of figured it out. Make some suggestions, I'll show you the way to figure it out. But once you've sort of gone through the thought process and then said, oh, now I get it. It's like the visualization exercise. It's when you get to the point where you go, that's what it looks like when I look from this side. Now I get it. Okay? Then you've got some permanent learning. All right. All right. Another question?
For the upper molars preparation, you told us to preserve the marginal custal, the custal margin, to mark it with a pencil and not to,
Oh, okay, if you're doing a 3/4 crown.
okay, if you're doing a full crown, we have to go through it, of course, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Just to have that clearance.
We want a full millimeter clearance on the A plane, and we're doing the facial reduction on a full crown, and a secondary plane, and putting a bevel on that cusp bridge. And yeah, we gotta get lots of gold over there. So again, we're preserving it on the 3/4 crown because we don't want to see any gold. Okay, the full gold crown, obviously, we're not worried about that, are we?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're gonna have a lot more reduction. Yeah. All right, yes,
Do we do 3/4 crown and mandibular too?
who's we?
What?
Who is we?
I
I mean, is there a purpose for that?
yeah. Because,
I can relate that to you right now.
yeah.
I was visiting a friend yesterday. She has a full gold crown on tooth number 30. And as I'm talking to her, I see the light reflecting off the gold periodically, and every time I talk to her and I see that light reflecting off the gold, I'm thinking, boy, she should have had a 3/4 crown done there instead of a full gold crown. She doesn't care at all. She's not particularly vain about that kind of thing. But as a dentist, I'm thinking, okay, 3/4 crown, and that gold, that little light reflection wouldn't be showing.
But for that, we would do the 3/4 crown where we would have the facial surface
Preserved.
preserved.
Yeah, we're not cutting the facial surface. We're not doing axial reduction on the facial. Now remember, the A plane, that's occlusal reduction. It has nothing to do with axial reduction. So once we've got the occlusal reduction, A, B, and C, and we're all happy with that, then we're not doing the facial axial reduction. We're not doing a secondary plane. We're going to be careful to preserve the mesial buccal area. Because the mesial buccal area, that's where there's gold like this, and light goes in the mouth, hits that, bounces back off, and goes into somebody's eye, and they can see the glint of gold. So yeah, for the mandibular tooth, even though the entire occlusal surface is covered with gold, the facial reduction, the mesial facial axial reduction, determines most about what's seen conversationally. So that's what we're trying to preserve.
But wouldn't be the occlusal and the lingual would also be visible and
The lingual is a little hard to imagine. Now, if I'm talking, I'm going to be talking like this, and somebody's standing over here and saying, oh, I can see the lingual surface, that would be unusual, wouldn't it? Now, on the occlusal surface, if I'm, talking like this, and yeah, in a normal conversational patterns, we're not going to see the occlusal surface on the lower teeth very much. It all depends on, how much you gesticulate and emphasize things and the angle of your head and so forth. But 95% of the time, if we're going to see light reflecting back off a gold crown that's on the lower arch, it's from the mesial buccal area. Now, even if you had to extend mesial buccally, if you had to extend that margin out to the point where it would have gold that's reflecting, did I mention it to this class? We can keep the gold in the contact area more and then backfill that space with composite.
Yeah.
Did I talk about that? Yeah, I talked about how I had that done on maxillary 3/4 crown for myself. So again, it depends on the sensitivity of the patient, depends on what they're interested in, what they want to present to the world as far as their appearance and so forth. So there's so much variation on that, which is of course a great thing. You'll find different, in Newport Beach, California, you won't find anybody where you can see any gold when they're talking. It's not going to happen. In Laguna Beach, California, you'll see lots of people that have gold crowns and, don't care particularly one way or the other if somebody sees it. So different communities have totally different mindsets when it comes to their appearance and how they present themselves to the world, what they care about the most. Two cities, both pretty much equally affluent, but with a totally different mindset, 5 miles apart. It's a very unique situation. Okay. So again, when it comes to finding out where you want to put your practice, then that determines the quality and the nature of the dentistry that you will be doing. And, I always prefer to have a practice in an area where, I can do some dentistry that's going to serve people well that can't afford, really high-end dentistry. They can't afford really expensive stuff, but, they can afford to have it done well. And if they come to you, then you do it well, and then they're well served. But it doesn't have to be an affluent community. When I had my practice, half of my patients were retired people. Another third of my patients were people that had been involved in the drug trade. Can you imagine? So it was in an area where it's very well known in California. It was very well known for having a lot of methamphetamine labs. So yeah, worked with a lot of patients that have a problem because of methamphetamine addiction and so forth. But, people that have gotten out of it, but, not making a whole lot of money and, have a dental problem and they're in pain and they need some help. So, yeah, how you cite your practice determines, what you learn and what you have to learn and what you develop in order to serve your patients well, whoever those patients are. So anyway, that's a long answer to a short question. Yeah, that can be very important. It doesn't seem as though, but, remember, the A-plane is the occlusal surface, and the axial reduction, that's a whole different thing when it comes to visibility. Okay?
Okay, so if we are doing, suppose like bridge on number 1, 2, and 3, or maybe 2, 3, and 4.
That would be more likely.
Three crown bridge.
Three unit bridge.
3 or either 2, 3, or 4.
Okay?
So how would we decide the taper, and how would we mention same exit taper throughout all the?
Uh-huh. Okay, so when it comes to evaluating draw on a bridge, okay, when we do the prep, we'd like to have the tapers the same on the 2 abutment rest preparations. So, we look down the arch and we can do the lingual side of this one, the lingual side of that one, and we know we're keeping the same taper. Buccal side of this one, buccal side of that one. Proximally, of course, everything like this. How we evaluate the draw is a little tricky. I'll talk about that more on Friday, because we'll be doing preps with 2 boxes. We've done preps with 2 grooves. The 2 grooves have to draw together, but 2 boxes drawing together is a little bit more of an obvious issue to look for. But if we have to have 2 boxes that draw together, we have 2 retentive features. They happen to be on the same tooth. They both have to have a mutual path of draw. If we have 2 retentive features that are on different teeth, they still have to have a mutual path of draw. So if it's on tooth number 4 and tooth number 2, you can't have one prep drawing this way and one prep drawing this way, okay? That doesn't work. They have to have a parallel path of draw, okay? And in order to evaluate that, we have to be using the mirror appropriately and looking down the walls and comparing between one tooth and the other tooth. We have to look at opposing sets of walls between the 2 teeth. So you have this prep here and you have a facial lingual wall, this prep here and a facial lingual wall. The facial wall has to converge with the lingual wall. The facial wall has to converge with the lingual wall. But the facial wall here has to converge with the lingual wall here. On 2 separate teeth. The facial wall on this tooth has to converge with the lingual wall on this tooth. And the diagonals and the proximal surfaces and so forth. So there's a process that you go through in order to determine if you have all the opposing sets of walls between the 2 preps doing what they need to do, either converging or diverging, to make sure that there's a mutual path of draw between the 2. So it's a little more complicated, but it's based on the same principles we've already talked about. Okay? And again, we're looking down the axis in the mirror, and we're using 1 eye or 2 eyes, and this kind of thing. But again, it's 2 retentive features that have to work together. Okay? But again, we'll see a little bit more on that on Friday. Okay? Okay, so let's continue our discussion of PFMs and take out the metal. Okay, so we're going to not have metal substructure right now. So now all of a sudden we have a prep that's all ceramic, could be all porcelain. the restoration is going to be all porcelain, so the preparation has to be appropriate for that. Porcelain likes two things. Well, it doesn't like one thing and it likes one thing. Porcelain likes to have really good bulky substance at the margins, so 90-degree bulk of porcelain at all the margins is required. And we need to make sure that there's no sharp corners anywhere. If you get a sharp corner in a prep, either an internal line angle or an external line angle, if there's porcelain there, it's going to cause fracture. It's going to tend to keep the forces and the pressures and the stresses built up in that crown, and it might very well fracture. Okay, so we're going to take the preps that we did yesterday and modify them a little bit to complete the picture for doing a full ceramic. Okay. Now again, if we have a full ceramic, the taper is important in that there needs to be enough taper so there's no mechanical stress on the crown. So if there's enough taper so there's no mechanical stress on the crown, it could be a lot of taper. Is that okay? How do we retain the crown on the tooth if there's a lot of taper?
Retention glue.
That would be great if it were a PFM. But again, we can't use retention grooves for ceramics. Okay, that creates a lot of stress in the ceramic. So probably if you put a ceramic in a retention groove, at some point the ceramic would break and the ceramic that's in the groove would stay there, and then the crown would fall off. Okay. Gold or PFM metal, retention grooves work great. So again, we cannot use mechanical retention for a ceramic, all ceramic crown.
Cements.
We use adhesion. Okay, we have to have chemical adhesion between the ceramic and the tooth. Now, the tooth substance, if you're doing a full ceramic crown, what tooth substance are we needing to bond to?
Dentin.
Only dentin. Typically, only dentin. Now, on Friday, we'll talk about onlays and ceramic onlays, and there we have enamel at all the margins. For a full crown, we have dentin at all the margins, so we have to make sure we get good bond to dentin. How do we get a good bond? How do we get a good adhesive bond to dentin?
Dentin bonding agent primers.
Primer. Yes, so we etch and we rinse and we dry, put a primer on. Can we light cure a primer?
Yes.
No point in trying because there's a particular chemical that's missing from the primer.
The activator, light activator.
Yeah, camphorquinone. Yeah, so that absorbs the light and initiates the polymerization process. It's not in the primers. So no, it can't light cure a primer. But you're going to put it on the tooth, you're going to let it sort of penetrate into the tubules and into the surface, and you might do a couple layers. It has a solvent in it. You have to wait for the solvent to evaporate. You might blow a little air across the top to help the solvent evaporate. You're not blowing it thin. It's going to get real thin. So maybe a couple layers, and then you have the dentin surface prepared well to have the adhesive cement polymerize at that surface. When the adhesive cement polymerizes at a prime dentin surface, the primer polymerizes within the surface, and it makes what we call a hybrid layer. That sound familiar? Okay, so that's how we get good bonding to dentin. Okay. But imagine if you've done the prep, you've etched the prep, you've done everything you needed to, you put the primer on, and then you turn this way and the patient swallows and saliva covers the dentin surface, then you have to start all over again. Okay, you've got to contaminate it. So if you let that happen, the crown's going to fall off.
Doctor, I had a question. So when we were doing composites like back home, so we had this like bonding agent like generations like 7-in-1 where you just put it and then you cure it. So I didn't understand. So is the primer also involved, like present in the 7-in-1?
Okay, what's it called, a bonding agent?
Yeah, it's called bonding agent.
Okay, and bonding agents are also called adhesives, and they're also called unfilled resins.
Okay.
So when you have the same resin that you use for the composite, but without the filler,
Yeah.
that's called a bonding agent or an adhesive or an unfilled resin. And that's what you use to do the first layer on the dentin and light cure it. Okay, and then you start to add so you're just covering the surface of the prep like I demonstrated the other day with the bonding agent, and you light cure that, and then you build it up increment by increment with the composite. Okay, so the unfilled resin is basically like the adhesive cement that we use in crown cementation. Okay, basically it's the same thing, except for the fact that the unfilled resin requires light to cure, and the adhesive cement is at least dual cure. It may cure with light, but if you're cementing a gold crown, that doesn't help, right? So it has to also auto cure, all right? And there's a whole bunch of different cements. We talked a little bit during the workshop on composite restoration about the oxygen inhibited layer, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of my favorite cements for luting crowns is called Panavia. It's a two-part mix. You inject it onto a pad, you mix it up together, and you can let it sit there all day and it won't set. It stays nice and soft and fluid. So you can mix it, and then you can pick it up at any time and put it in the crown and cement the crown, and then it sets. What's going on? It's really a cool material. Okay, so again, the free radical polymerization in composites won't happen when it's exposed to oxygen. Okay, that's an inhibitor. So Panavia, you mix it up, put it on a pad, there's oxygen all around it. It won't set. As soon as you put it in the crown and put it on the tooth, then the air is pushed away, and now it sets. Now, they also recommend that at the margins, especially if you have an open margin, at the margins you inject some stuff around there that's kind of like toothpaste. It's a gel that excludes the air from the margin, and then the cement sets all the way to the actual surface of the tooth. Okay? Then you have to again, scrape off the excess. Really cool material. But that's basically operating as the unfilled resin in a sense.
Okay. So because primer, like I've only read in books that you first need to apply the layer of primer, but I've never put a primer, so.
Yeah, well, you're going to be starting pretty soon. Anyway, that's the purpose of it. So for cementing a crown, the cement has to stick to the tooth. Okay, without the primer, it won't. Right? Now, there are some companies that make, self-etching primers. They make all kinds of two-in-one things and so forth. So if they're making a cement that you don't need to use a dentin primer on, then that's going to be compromised in terms of its adhesion to the dentin. And, I've had that in my mouth a couple times and the crowns fell off because the cement did not use the technology that we just described. Okay, now I referred to it a little bit before, but, when we're cementing a porcelain crown to a tooth, we obviously have to get the adhesion to the tooth, which we just described. We also have to get the adhesion to the crown. How do we get that?
By etching the.
So are you going to use a different material?
Glass ionomer.
Okay, so glass ionomer, so we already discussed how to get an adhesive resin to bond to the dentin. Glass ionomer doesn't bond to dentin anywhere near that well. And glass ionomer doesn't bond to ceramic very well either.
We need to etch the inner surface of the crown.
Okay, let's get back to the minute. You still have a question.
But you're talking about PFM now?
So, no, I'm talking about full ceramic. Now, the PFM, glass ionomer, go for it. Okay, we're not relying on adhesion for a PFM. Okay, it's a metal coping. Okay, it's mechanically retained. Glass ionomer is great. Okay, that's by far the most commonly used cement for anything that's mechanically retained.
In clinics, we did glass ionomer everywhere.
Yeah, and I've had people that I've worked with that in their practice, they use glass ionomer for cementing full ceramics, and they have crowns falling off. Okay, I had one guy come in, he says, our crowns are falling off. You're trying to figure out why that is. They were over-tapering everything. And I said, well, okay, the over-tapering is part of the problem. And I said, what are you cementing with? He said, glass ionomer. I said, that's the rest of the problem right there. So if you're making your preps not too tapered, and you're making a full ceramic crown, and you're using glass ionomer, it may, you're mechanically retaining it, basically. And the only thing you have to worry about is fracture. Now, if it's zirconia, you won't have to worry about it as much as if it were porcelain, but it's still something that's of a concern. Okay. But the adhesive cements, those are what are designed to be cementing porcelain to tooth structure. Okay. And if we want to get a good bonded tooth structure, we've got to do the primer. Okay, and get that done. Now, how do we bond adhesively to porcelain?
By etching the inner surface?
By etching the inside surface of the crown. And what do we etch it with?
Hydrochloric.
Yeah. kind of like-
Hydrofluoric acid, yeah. And again, that's a dangerous acid. Okay? It's a weak acid, but it penetrates the skin. So if you get it on you or get it in the patient's mucosa, it penetrates and goes inside and then it burns. And you can't wash it off. Okay? So be careful with that stuff. Okay? It dissolves glass. Okay? So when I was a kid, I was really interested in chemistry. And one of my father's friends was a chemist, and he had a catalog of chemical apparatus and stuff like that from the 1930s. And yeah, so as a kid, I loved that catalog. Does that make me a nerd or a dork or I don't know what it is these days? But I was fascinated with that catalog. And I still remember, to this day, I remember there was we used to have these reagent bottles. So if you have acid and you put it in a bottle, they have these they're like antiques now, but these old bottles that are, they're carved out with the name of the acid, H2SO4 and stuff like that. And there was a bottle containing hydrofluoric acid, which I thought was wonderful. But the bottle that was containing hydrofluoric acid, it was designed, the reagent bottle for hydrofluoric acid was not made of glass because hydrofluoric acid would dissolve the glass. So what do you think it was made of?
Plastic?
Plastic.
Yeah, see, that's what your generation would think. In the 1930s, guess what? No plastic,
Yeah.
no internet. There was electricity.
Maybe metal? No, but metal. Right.
So what do you think it could be made out of? Too absorbent.
Metal.
Metal?
No, it'll dissolve metal too. Wax. Yeah, really hard wax. So it looked just like glass. It was the coolest thing. I just thought that was brilliant when I was a kid. Anyway, hydrofluoric acid, don't mess around with it. Okay, but when the lab etches your crown and sends it back to you, they'll etch it with hydrofluoric acid. Now, when you try it on, of course, you've contaminated the etch surface and you have to re-etch it. So when you etch it at chairside, stay away from the patient. Sometimes you have to etch porcelain in their mouth. If you're doing a porcelain repair on like an expensive bridge or something, then you better know how to put a rubber dam over a bridge. If you don't, then you're taking a big risk for your patient. In any event, so we etch the inside of the crown with hydrofluoric acid, and then we have the inside surface of the crown is basically a hyper inorganic surface. It's a really highly activated inorganic surface, silicon and oxygen. Okay? It's basically like sand. All right? And the cement that we're going to be using is a totally organic cement. So you know the thing about inorganic and organic, right? They tend not to like each other.
Yeah.
So we have to make them like each other. We can't cement a porcelain crown with an organic cement unless we do something to make them like each other. We have to make the cement think that the crown is not as organic as it thought, or inorganic as it thought. So what do?
Shining.
We use a silonating agent. So it's a long molecule. It's got a carbon-carbon double bond at one end that polymerizes into the cement, and it's very organic, and the other end has a silicon and some oxygen on it. So it loves that porcelain surface once we've etched it and activated it. So we paint a little bit of the silinating agent or the coupling agent on the inside of the crown, and then we're ready to cement the crown. Put the cement in, put it on the tooth, and then we did adhesion to both the tooth side and to the crown side. That's how we keep crowns on, especially when we got significant taper. Okay. So while we're at it, I had a patient come in one time with a gold crown in her hand. So she had a full gold crown in her hand. I did not do the gold crown. It's the first time I ever saw the patient. She came into my office. She had a full gold crown in her hand. And she says, I've saved my money and I've got $50 and can you re-cement the crown for me? And I look inside the crown, and again, it's a full gold crown, but I look inside the crown and it's filled almost fully with amalgam. What's going on?
Restoration, like post root canal restoration must have come out, like.
No, not necessarily post-root canal. If it had been a post-root canal, they would have done a post in the core, and that would not have fallen off. So this is a vital tooth.
It was already amalgam restoration before doing the crown, and it was quite deep, so it didn't.
Yeah, the amalgam restoration wasn't really a restoration, it was a build-up for the crown. So the tooth was too short. And the dentist built up the tooth bulk with amalgam. But unfortunately, there was a period of time in the late 80s and early 90s where it was thought that we could adhesively bond amalgam to dentin. And that didn't turn out to work very well. But there were products that were being sold at the time to do that. Okay, so apparently that guy decided he would adhesively bond the amalgam to the tooth, what was left of it, and build the whole tooth up like that. But the original tooth was just a little short thing. You know, the walls all the way around were no more than 1 millimeter. So totally non-retentive. And the amalgam was great, but the crown was relying on the amalgam to retain the crown. And then we're relying on adhesion to retain the buildup, the amalgam buildup onto the tooth, and the adhesion between the amalgam and the tooth broke down, so everything fell off. So I took the amalgam out of the crown, and she says, okay, I've got my $50. So how could we do that? How could we re-cement that crown? There's no wall height, virtually. There's nice margins. I tried the crown back on, it fit the margins well, but you know, it would just tip like this. There's no mechanical retention whatsoever.
Composite build.
Okay, so if we do a composite buildup, well, we can do an amalgam buildup. You know, but the problem is if we're doing any kind of a buildup, we've already got the crown made. So you have to do a buildup to match the crown. That's not going to happen. So if we're building it up in any respect, we can't really shape the buildup to match an already existing crown. Okay? But you know, virtually every dentist would have said, okay, I'm going to have to make a new crown. But she's only got $50. So could you help her for $50? Okay. So obviously we have to adhesively bond the crown to the tooth. Okay, we know how to handle the tooth with the etching and priming and so forth. But can we adhesively bond to gold? We already talked about what it takes to adhesively bond to ceramics and porcelain. It doesn't seem likely that we can adhesively bond to gold, does it? But there's a trick. If you have $50 device, you can adhesively bond to gold. Most dentists don't know about this, and most dentists don't care. If you tell them about it, they'll forget it immediately because they don't want to know. Why not? Because they want to do a new crown. Okay? They don't want to have to even take an extra minute to try to use a crown that's already existing because, you know, for somebody that only has, I mean, she saved her money. She saved up $50. So can we do something that's going to help her? Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna take that gold crown, we can clean up the inside of it, and we're going to electrolytically deposit tin. We're gonna electroplate tin on the inside of the crown. So now it's a tin surface on the inside. Okay, and it's bonded to the gold through metallic kind of situation. So now the inside of the gold is tin. It's going to pick up oxygen from the air. It's going to become tin oxide. Remember the periodic table?
Yeah.
Carbon, silicon, germanium, tin. Same group, same valence shell structure. So if we have tin oxide on the inside of the crown, it's a lot like silicon oxide. It's a lot like an all-ceramic crown. So then we silanate it, and the silicon oxide likes the tin oxide just as well. And so we have the silanating agent. Now we have converted the gold into an organic surface that wants to polymerize in with our cement. We fill the entire crown with cement, put it on the tooth, and so we've done a composite, in effect, we've done a composite buildup of the tooth and shaped it using the crown. All right? Now, how long is that going to last? I don't know. I had not done that exact procedure before that particular patient came in. So I said, okay, let's say it lasts a year. Save your money. Start putting some money in an envelope every week and save some money, and we'll see where we are in a year. And so she came back, actually in about a year, the crown was still on, but the tooth hurt. And so I looked into it a little bit more and did some testing and determined that I needed to do a root canal. So I did the root canal on that tooth through the crown. And I drilled down through the gold, I drilled down through all that resin cement. That was the coolest thing ever. Had a good light. I'm going down through all that cement. It was like drilling through a piece of plastic, clear, like plexiglass or something like that. It was so clear and so beautifully, no bubbles. It was just amazing. So I went down, got in the pulp chamber, did the root canal, shaped the canal, put a post in, refilled it almost all the way to the top with composite, and then I actually did a gold foil to restore the occlusal surface again. And she'd saved her money by that point and could pay me for that, but it was still a lot cheaper than having to get a new crown. So again, when you know the materials and you know the technology that's available to you, you can do some amazing things. You can do some things that will really be a benefit to your patient. But you have to figure out who to believe about what's available and what it can do and so forth. And the sales reps that come by your office, they're going to try to sell you on something that is going to save you time. That's the whole thing. They're trying to make money by selling the materials on commission and so forth. But it may be that there's some things that you can do that will actually benefit your patient. And a lot of times if we're doing something that's relatively simple to benefit the patient, it doesn't take us all that long. So we can do more of that kind of stuff and make just as much money as we would by doing a crown on a patient that can't afford it, by helping several people that in a simpler way. All right, so anyway, adhesive dentistry, hugely important, but you need to know the full extent to which it's possible and all the problems that we could potentially solve with it that would benefit our patients. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, that was great. I delayed getting started so much time. So I'm going to be here a little bit longer this afternoon because I have an appointment later. So we'll have a little bit more time for me to work with you on those extra preps, what you've decided that you want to do some extra practice on before the end of the day. But for right now, we're going to talk about how to take these PFM preparations and modify them so they would work for no metal, for all ceramic. Okay? So not a ceramic metal crown anymore, just a ceramic crown. So we have to make some changes. So we're going to basically do a few more steps on each one, and we'll have an all ceramic crown prep. So we can learn how to do the PFM, what you did yesterday, learn how to do the all ceramic crown for today. And then after we finish that, we'll change some of the PFM preps you did yesterday. We'll modify them to make full ceramics. And we'll start by changing the central incisor, because once we've done that together, we've learned what we can from that, we're going to change it, change the adjacent teeth. So we have proximal contacts on both sides of one central incisor, then we're going to do class 3 preps. So we'll talk about class 3 preps at this point too. Okay? Are we clear? All right, so as we've discussed, when you do the PFM, we have an angled shoulder, and the angled shoulder has a sharp internal line angle. Okay? And all ceramic crowns not going to like that. So when we did the angulation of the shoulder yesterday, we used the 837 burr. So we started out with a horizontal shoulder. So when we do steps 1 and 2, 3 depth cuts, joined together, we have a horizontal shoulder all the way from one embrasure to the other. When we angle it to make a PFM, we use the end of the 837 burr like this and angle it like that. Okay, so we go from there to there. If we're going to do a full ceramic crown, we don't want to have a sharp internal line angle, so we're going to have a rounded internal line angle. Like this. So we have to take this horizontal shoulder, convert it into an angled shoulder, but this time with a rounded internal line angle. So we can't use the burr with the shoulder end. We have to use a burr that will create a rounded internal line angle. So what burr do you think we should use to angle the shoulder in the case of a full ceramic crown? We could use a round-ended burr, but it's easier to just use a chamfer burr. So I have a chamfer burr that looks like this, so we've been working with this, 878K. That'll create a rounded internal line angle. Okay? But how do we use it? What do we do in order to go from the horizontal shoulder to the angled shoulder with a rounded internal line angle using that burr? So what we have to do basically is visualize what we're looking for. We're looking for a prep that looks like this. It's going to end up with an angled shoulder with a slightly rounded internal line angle. So we start with the burr, put the end of the burr at the margin, and drop the margin gingerly, then raise the burr a little bit incisally, and then cut in again. Raise the burr a little bit incisally, cut in again, and each time we do that, we remove a little bit of tooth structure. And then we end up with an angled shoulder with a rounded internal line angle. It's a little bit more complicated than just leaning the burr out and angling the shoulder the way we did yesterday. We have to take the chamfer burr, the same taper as the wall, drop the margin gingerly, and then raise it a little bit at a time as we approach the axial wall. And do that all the way from this embrasure to this embrasure here. Okay, well, we've already angled the shoulder on the preps that we did yesterday, so what we're going to have to do today is, to learn this technique, we're going to re-angle the shoulder. So that's going to make us drop gingerly a little bit more than we would normally go. We're just learning the technique. So if I re-angle the shoulder, I'm going to take the end of the burr and drop the margin gingerly a little bit, and then I'm going to raise it a little bit at a time as I approach the axial wall, and try to end up with probably it's going to be a little steeper angle. A lot of times it's going to be a little steeper angle than we would normally want, but it's going to have a rounded internal angle. So we're just learning how to do it. So go around the margin, drop the margin gingerly, and then raise the burr a little bit at a time as it reaches the axial wall. And then we're in good shape. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to do to the PFM preps that we did yesterday, is re-angle the shoulder to create a rounded internal line angle. If we knew that we were doing a full ceramic prep yesterday, we never would have angled it with this burr in the first place. We would have angled it immediately with the chamfer burr and gotten this angle here, and the correct angle, and so forth. But anyway, again, we're just learning the technique today. Now, on the lingual surface, we have a chamfer. It's a 1/2 millimeter chamfer, and that's what we want because it's metal, and we know that we just need a 1/2 millimeter chamfer for metal. But now we don't have any metal today. It's an all ceramic prep. So what we did yesterday with a 1/2 millimeter chamfer, we're going to have to increase the size of the chamfer. We're going to have to get more axial reduction because we can't have just 1/2 millimeter for ceramic. We need a full millimeter for ceramic, like we did on the facial. Okay? So right now, we have a chamfer on the lingual and the proximal like this, 0.5 millimeter. And now we have to do another step to convert it into a 1 millimeter chamfer. So we have to figure out how to do that without getting a ski jump. So a lot of you guys are pretty good at making a 1 millimeter chamfer already. So you're ahead of the game. But wait a minute. Every time you do, you get a ski jump, right? And we know to look for that. We know to look down the wall if it's a heavy chamfer. If it's heavier than 0.5, probably it's a ski jump. We know how to check it with a ball burnisher. See if the ball burnisher slides up. We know how to look from the side, see if there's a lip. Probably there is. But so let's assume that you did a great job yesterday and got a nice 0.5 millimeter chamfer around that lingual. So it looks like this. So now I'm going to draw the picture a little bit differently so that 0.5 millimeter looks a little bit more like half of this. So let's say this is the 0.5 millimeter chamfer that we've done already. So that's the burr that we used. I'm just blowing it up a little bit. Now I want to get deeper axially. So I want to move the axial wall in farther. So how do I do that without getting a ski jump? How do I move the axial wall in farther without getting a ski jump at the margin? Well, I've already got my margin.
You keep away from the margin.
Keep away from the margin. How do I do that?
Go towards the body of the tooth more.
Where's the end of the burr? So I'm reducing axially like this, but I want to stay away from the margin. How do I stay away from the margin if I'm cutting deeper axially? Same technique as we used here. Lift the burr. Raise the burr. Okay? We've got a nice margin here. We're happy with that. So if I want to move the wall in axially, I lift the burr up a couple tenths of a millimeter and move the whole wall in farther. And then the end of the burr ends up like here. So now, once we just smooth this out a little bit, it doesn't take much, we've got an angled shoulder with a slightly rounded internal line angle. Okay, and there's no risk of a ski jump because we never touched the margin again. We stayed away from the margin by lifting the burr incisally. Okay, so you got to look along the wall horizontally so you know you're lifting the burr a little bit. Okay, you've got to see that you're lifting that burr. So that's how to do a 1 millimeter chamfer without getting a ski jump. Just lift the burr up. We have the margin at the beginning. We have a nice chamfer. That's exactly what we want. So just leave it alone. Lift the burr up a couple tenths of a millimeter. Make sure you can see that you're lifting the burr up, and then move the axial wall in. You're going to cut some more, and then you're going to look in the mirror down that wall and measure it and see if it's a millimeter. If not, then lift it up and move the axial wall in some more. Look down the wall in the mirror, make sure it's a millimeter. Keep adjusting it until it's clearly a millimeter all around this area. Okay, so now we have an axial reduction that 360 degrees all the way around the tooth. It's a full millimeter everywhere. So that's what we're looking for. Again, we have no metal, so we've got to get enough bulk of ceramic. And so we're going to move this wall in like this. So we're going to have the same axial reduction that we had on the facial. In fact, now we've got a rounded internal line angle on the facial with an angled shoulder with a rounded internal line angle. We have essentially an angled shoulder on the lingual with a rounded internal line angle. That begs the question, what do we call that kind of margin? Do we call it an angled shoulder with a slightly rounded internal line angle, or is there a simpler name?
Slope shoulder.
With a rounded internal line angle. But what if we just call it a heavy chamfer? That works. Certainly easier to say. So 1 millimeter chamfer, heavy chamfer, whatever you want to call it, that's the kind of margin we're going to do for full ceramic. We're going to make sure that the bulk of the ceramic at the margins is as close to 90 degrees as we can get it. So again, we have plenty of bulk, we have plenty of thickness, so it's going to resist breakage And again, as long as we don't have mechanical retention, we're going to have minimal stresses on it. Okay, well that's pretty simple. We re-angle the shoulder and get a rounded internal line angle. We increase the size of the chamfer a little bit on the lingual to get a full millimeter chamfer. We've already got the margin that's smooth and continuous all the way around. We're just moving the axial wall. We're just moving the axial. We're not doing anything at the margin at all. And we got our margin. We're happy with that from yesterday. So just move the axial wall in. But you're going to have to lift the burr in order to not to damage the margin. Okay, and then we're going to do a little bit more in the size reduction, a couple tenths of a millimeter. We're going to do a little bit more lingual ax reduction, a couple tenths of a millimeter. We'll get, consequently, a little more clearance from the opposing tooth. And then we're going to make sure everything is rounded, because there's a lot of well-defined edges here, aren't there? So we're going to make sure we round over everything. We're going to round over this marginal ridge down here. We're going to round over the incisal edge here and over here. And everything's rounded all the way along this facial side of the incisal edge. Down here. Going to come all the way down the marginal ridge and round over that edge there. Nothing's well defined, nothing's sharply defined. Everything's rounded. If we have, this is a reasonable taper. Whether it's a PFM or a full ceramic, it's a reasonable taper. If we were to taper even more than that, it's still okay for a full ceramic. Not so much for a PFM, but still okay for a full ceramic. That's it. So again, we're just taking like 3 or 4 more steps on what we did yesterday, and we have a full ceramic prep. So now we will learn how to do both.
So when we do rounded angles on the shoulder margin, usually we don't
Internally,
we don't touch the facial wall, facial reduction, right? What we have done.
we don't reduce anymore. Yeah, when we're angling the shoulder gingivally, all we're doing is we're dropping the margin gingivally and then raising the burr as it approaches the axial wall, but we stop when we get to the same axial wall. We're not reducing axially anymore on the facial. We already have our millimeter. We're just changing the shape of the internal line angle.
So we just touch the lingual wall.
Yeah, on the lingual we have half a millimeter chamfer. We need 1 millimeter chamfer, so we're reducing the whole wall. There we have to move the wall in so that we end up with 1 millimeter all the way around. And the same basic margin form all the way around too.
Okay. Doctor, is there any chance of getting an undercut when we're trying to reduce the axial wall?
Any chance of getting an undercut?
Yeah, because when you're lifting the burr and then moving axially, so is there any chance of getting an undercut when
Absolutely. If you're not paying attention at all, you can easily get an undercut. If you don't notice that you're leaning the burr the wrong way, and you're just trying to make a heavier chamfer, you'll get an undercut. So again, when we do axial reduction on any prep, we're making sure we have the right taper first. Once you know you've got the right taper, then we reduce axially until we get whatever margin form we want at the bottom. That's how we do it. Okay? So if we have a half millimeter chamfer, we make sure we keep the end of the burr at the margin. We just go axially at the right taper until we get a chamfer. If we want to make the chamfer heavier, we raise the burr up a little bit, use the same taper, and then reduce until we get a heavier chamfer. But again, the first thing we do is adjust the taper. Once we're happy with the taper, so we know it's going to draw, we know we have the appropriate taper, then you reduce until you get the ax reduction that you want and until you get the margin form that you want. But if you're ignoring the taper, if all you want is a chamfer, okay, if all you want to do is make a chamfer, then you could just make a chamfer by cutting in the bottom of the tooth. Or, like I said before, if all you want is a shoulder, you can cut the shoulder with a burr like this. You've got a shoulder there. You just have no axial reduction, and you have no possibility of making a crown. Okay, so we're going to be very careful to make sure we start with the taper, reduce axially until we get the axial reduction that we want and the margin form that we want. Okay, so if you do that, you focus on that in that order, it's always going to come out great.
If you're doing a full ceramic crown from the beginning, can you start with an 87K, or do you have to go with the 837 first?
87K, what's that?
The 878K.
Oh, the 87, oh, okay.
The round taper, can you start your prep with it first?
Absolutely. I just recommend against it. Okay. So when you're in practice, you could use a chamfer burr for the whole thing. You might even have a chamfer burr that makes a chamfer that's this big. You might have a chamfer burr that's this big at the end. Okay, that makes this whole size chamfer. That's an 878K 021. In practice, a lot of people use that. Now, how are you going to get that through the proximal contact? Well, on a typodont, you're not. On a patient, you can most of the time, because remember, how do we get through the contact without hitting the adjacent tooth? What do?
Going
You
to
go gingivally, okay? And that verb means you go very far gingivally. On a typodont, you'll be 3 millimeters subgingival. On a patient, the gingiva might be down there already. So we're far enough subgingival so that even that big, huge burr will go through the proximal contact. So a lot of guys for full ceramics will use that burr, the 021. Makes a 1 millimeter chamfer right from the very beginning. But on a typodont, we don't have the luxury of using that big burr. On the facial, we're wanting to be totally in control of what's happening on that facial reduction. And the 837 on that works beautifully for what we're doing. Again, we just make the horizontal shoulder, angle it with the chamfer burr. It breaks it up into more steps, so it's more controllable, and it's really important. So we're going to try to make it as controllable as possible. But in your practice, you might decide to use a chamfer burr for doing that. You can make depth cuts with your chamfer burr. It's just a little bit harder to see at the bottom that you're going to get enough axial reduction. So we've kind of chosen burrs that are going to make it the most controllable for you. But again, you invent things, figure out things. You'll find things that work the best for you, the way you're doing your dentistry as you go along. I ran into a dentist once about 30 some years ago. He said, yeah, all I use is a round burr. I use a round burr for everything. Okay, how's that work? I didn't even want to know. But he was quite proud of the fact that he did all dentistry with one burr. Okay, that's, I think, foolhardy. But, everybody figures out what works for them. Hopefully it works for your patients well, too. All right, so you got some choices. And so what I'm going to talk about now is, what happens if you don't have access to the burrs that we've been using. Now, the workbook does ask a question about a round-ended burr. Remember that question? How do you make a chamfer with a round-ended burr? And I circled the right answer for everybody, but I'm not sure anybody went back and looked at the answer and thought about, okay, why is that the right answer? So, can you picture a round-ended burr? Can you draw a round-ended burr? Do the words lead you to a picture? So the chamfer burr comes to a point, right? So we're used to that. A round-ended burr, here's a tapered round-ended burr. So the end of the burr doesn't come to a point, it's round. It's like there's a circular shape down here. So at the tip of a round-ended burr, this would be an 856 burr. If it's an 856-016, any round-ended burr, at the tip, it's horizontal. At the tip of a chamfer burr, it's angled gingivally. That's why we use the chamfer burr to get a gingival slope to the prep as it approaches the margin. But here, it wouldn't slope gingivally, would it? So how could we make a chamfer? So we know the chamfer has to slope gingivally as it approaches the margin. How can we make a chamfer with this burr?
Won't we ditch the surface when you're trying to start looking around?
There's all kinds of mistakes you can make, but can you visualize how to make a chamfer with this burr?
Dipping the ball.
Well, let's use the same taper that we always use. So whatever taper we want, we choose the taper, and that's going to give us the prep taper, the convergence, and so forth. So put the burr at the right angle, and we're going to have to reduce axially, like we always do. But how do we stop so that we only get a chamfer? We don't want it to come out horizontally. So how do we use this burr and make a chamfer? So in the chamfer burr, we use half the burr, right? What if we use half the burr here? We have a prep that comes out like this. It's not sloping gingivally at the margin. that's effectively undermining the enamel if there's enamel at the margin. That's making a weak margin. So how do we use that burr and make a chamfer? You want something like this, right? So how do I make this shape from that burr? Don't use half the burr, right? Half the burr doesn't work. So let's use less than half the burr. How about a third of the burr? That's what I circled on there on your workbook. So we use a third of the burr. How about here? Let's only cut in this deep. Okay. If we only cut in that deep into the tooth, we have a nice chamfer right here. There is our chamfer. It's just a third of the burr. So again, if you have a round-ended burr, a third of it will give you a prep that slopes gingerly as it approaches the margin, so we're good. Okay, can you picture that? What if we've been using an 877 burr in the proximal area, right? So it gives a nice chamfer, but it's not tapered, so it's small enough to fit through. So that's a great burr. But what if you're in a practice or taking an exam and that burr is not available? And the 878K014 is too big to fit through the proximal contact. If you even have that. Maybe you have a round-ended burr like this. You can use that to make a chamfer around the lingual here and even lift it up and make it bigger. But in the proximal area, what are you going to look for if you're going to do the chamfer in the proximal area? Huh?
First of all, don't adjacent growth when you are trying to do the proximal reduction.
Yeah, you have to find a burr that's not going to hit the adjacent tooth. This burr clearly is not the right burr. Okay, it's way too big, and 2/3 of the burr is outside the prep, trying to hit the adjacent tooth. So obviously we're not going to use that burr. We don't have the 877, so what's the main quality of a burr that you're looking for to do the proximal reduction?
It should be thin and
It should be thin, right? So there are a couple possibilities. One is an 856, but a smaller one. So the 856-012. Round-ended burr. How do we make a chamfer from a round-ended burr? A third of the burr. How big is the chamfer going to be? It's probably going to be about 0.25. Now imagine having that little tiny tip and coming through there and just using a third of it. That's pretty hard to see, isn't it? So you better have some good loops and be able to see things clearly. And then you can just use a third of that burr. Still pretty tricky, huh? So a third of the burr, but we only get a 0.25 chamfer, so how do we make it a 0.5 chamfer? So it's thin enough so we can go through the proximal contact, go through once, we get a 0.25 chamfer, then what do we do? Huh? Go again and do what when we go again?
Make 0.5 like good size and go deep.
Yeah, more
Inside.
deeper inside. So 0.25.
Go what?
0.25. So with the width of that burr, it's 0.25. So if we move it more inside, more axially, so
Uh-huh.
0.25 and 0.5.
And as we do that, what do we do?
Jen,
Flip it gingival.
We move away from the margin so that we don't.
Okay, we elevate the burr incisally,
Yeah.
0.2 millimeters, just like we did here. We're using a burr to make a 0.5 millimeter chamfer, and if we want a 1 millimeter chamfer, we lift it up, move the wall in. Here we have a 1/4 millimeter chamfer. If you want to get it a little bit bigger, if you want to get a 0.5 millimeter chamfer, do a 1/4 millimeter, lift it up incisally, move the wall in. Same thing exactly. So the technique we're going to use today to make a 1 millimeter chamfer with a 0.5 millimeter burr, we can do the same thing over here. Now, you might have another burr. You might have this burr available to you. And so that's an 878K 012. So it's like the 014, but it's smaller, but it's a chamfer burr. So this one's a little bit easier. Just keep the end of the burr at the margin. And again, you get a 0.25 millimeter chamfer. Raise it up, move the wall in again, you get a 0.5 millimeter chamfer. Okay, so those are the things that we need to be thinking about. So as you go into new practice and you end up working with an assistant, the assistant gives you the burr block, you look in the burr block and you go, what are those? And whatever burrs are available to do that. Now, you might still go to the dentist afterwards and say, the owner of the practice, and you might say, you know, I can work a lot faster if I use this burr. I'll save time. And when you tell the owner that you're going to save time, what does he hear? I'm going to make more money. Okay? He's going to make more money. And so he's going to be very happy to invest in an $8 burr so that he can make, you know, extra $50. You know, that's a no-brainer. You know, as long as he's thinking things through.
Doctor, I had a question.
First of all, make sure you can.
Yeah, can you explain again what's the last three digit of the board number suggests, like the 016 or the 012? Is the greatest circumference of the board at the widest location?
Exactly. Yeah, so the last little bit, so the 021, where the burr is widest up here, it's 2.1 millimeters. Okay? This one at the widest point up here, so if this is where the shaft is, that's the widest part of the burr, that's 1.2. It's pretty small down here. This one also 1.2, this 1.6 up here. And of course, a burr that's not tapered, it's, you know, like the 877-009, it's 0.9 all the way along.
So how do we decide how much we would cut it using the end of the board? Because you know the circumference at the widest part, but we don't know what's the...
Yeah, just experience. The 878K014, we know it makes a nice half millimeter chamfer. The 016, I know that a third of it's going to make a half millimeter chamfer. I know these burrs that are smaller than that are going to make smaller chamfers, and we need to make them bigger. But ultimately, you're going to use the burr to make a chamfer, and then if you have to go through again, raise the burr and make a second pass, maybe even a third pass to get the amount of axe reduction you want with the margin form that you want, and that's what you do. Again, we're paying attention to the taper, the axe reduction, and the form of the margin. And if you have burrs that don't give you the margin form that you want right away, don't give you the axe reduction that you want right away, then you have to figure out how to use them in a little different technique. Again, we figure stuff out a lot as we go through our practice. Okay? Other questions?
Yeah, so talking about figuring things by ourselves, so yesterday, so I am like preparing for Buffalo and I used the burr set that they had, and instead of making a chamfer, I ended up making a shoulder on the lingual margin.
Yeah, probably usually 856.
I don't think they have the 856 in the kit, like as far as I know, they use a different burr. Like the 878K is basically, it's wider, like for the burr that they provide.
Oh, they have an 870, oh, that's right, they have an 878K016.
No, they have a 6878K.
Yeah, the 6878K is just set, it's an 878K, but the 6 or the 8 ahead of that means fine or coarse.
Okay.
The 878K is medium porosity.
Okay.
The 6 of the 8 means fine or coarse.
Okay, so when I was trying to make the chamfer margin on the lingual, I ended up making a shoulder. I don't know why. I just followed the.
Did you keep the end of the burr at the margin?
I did. I think I
Okay,
did.
then you got a chamfer.
Yeah.
Okay, and it had a rounded internal line angle.
Yeah.
But it's just a little more axe reduction than you would need for metal, isn't it? Okay, because it's a pretty big burr. So if you use the end of the burr at the margin, instead of getting a half millimeter chamfer, you're probably getting like a 0.8 millimeter chamfer. It's not necessarily a shoulder, it's just a heavy chamfer.
So
That
just
burr makes a
cut
heavy
less
chamfer.
with the.
So use a little bit less than half the burr.
Okay. So it's like with all the burrs that they provide are like they cut a lot more than expected. So in that case, I need to be I need to cut less, like that.
Then you have to figure it out.
That's the point. I need to figure it out. So
Yeah, isn't that horrible? You know, you have to figure stuff out in life, don't you?
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm giving you some examples, and then when it comes down to what you're going to actually specifically have to deal with, you know, we can figure it out together, but I'm going to make you do it first.
Okay.
Okay? Because, you know, in real life, you're the only one. Okay? Anyway, so we have a few things now that just sort of address the fact that, you know, we've selected burrs that are optimized for you to use to make it as easy as possible. And in your own life, in your own practice, and, you know, in school, you can, you know, not the exam necessarily, but when you're in school, you can get an 877 burr and do much better dentistry than all the other students. So keep that in mind. But, you know, in your practice, you can choose whatever burrs you want to make your life easy, to make your job more efficient, so you can make more money. If you're working for somebody else, as I said, at first you use what they've selected to do, but you might be able to alter that. But, we know what the prep should be. We know how the prep should work. We know how the prep is designed to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And we just have to figure out how to make a particular burr work for doing that prep. And it might have to be kind of inventive, and it might be very inefficient. But, then we change things around so it becomes more efficient. But at first, you got to figure out how to make this, how to use this to make that. Okay? Sometimes it's not obvious. Sometimes giving you a hint as to the kind of thought process that you have to go through. But, use part of the burr, it might not occur to you. Use part of the burr. Or it might not occur to you to use the burr with 2 passes or 3 passes in order to, and then get the axe reduction you want. But again, control the taper the whole time.
Like I did 2 passes and it turned out to be a shoulder, so for me, I think.
Yeah, all you needed to do was about half a pass. Okay, so you learned your lesson. You're not going to need to go through twice with that big, huge burr. Just use part of the burr. Okay. Yeah, when things become obvious, then you've really learned the lesson.